Welcome to our website, and thank you for watching this video on the foundations of your freedom. This video is the first in a series of videos on the subject, and this is a very important subject. Do you care about your freedom? Do you know what freedom is from a legal perspective? And can you prove that you're free in a court of law? Let's explore the answers to these important questions. In this video, we will look at the following subjects to answer those questions. We'll introduce the subject of freedom, what presidents and politicians say about freedom, why equality is the foundation of all your freedom, God's version of equality, why God hates hypocrisy and inequality, why people and governments are equal, why we all start out equal. We'll also show that the Constitution requires equality and equal treatment, that everything that is wrong with the present government is a product of inequality. We'll show you some of the lies governments tell about equality, the necessary precursors to freedom, and when freedom is impossible. President Barack Obama, a lawyer, helped to answer some of these questions in his inauguration speech. So let's watch it.
But in the words of Scripture, the time has come to set aside childish things. The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness.
Now, wait a minute. President Obama, in his speech, used the word happiness. What is the legal definition of the word happiness that he used in his speech? The answer is that it's the right to exclusively own property and to exclude all others, including governments, from using or benefiting from the use of the property. Property equals the pursuit of happiness. Here is what the Declaration of Independence says on this subject. In the Declaration of Independence, the word happiness in the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness has been equated by the U.S. Supreme Court as the right to own private property. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," there's that word again that President Obama used, "that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Any government that interferes or intends to interfere with the protection of private rights or private property therefore has the express or implied goal of maliciously making you unhappy." They also said in the 14th Amendment, where they used the phrase life, liberty, or property, notice they replaced the word or property with the phrase pursuit of happiness, because they're the same thing. Here's what the court said in Munn versus Illinois about the meaning of that phrase or property. They said, "The provision, that is the 14th Amendment, Section 1, is to be observed, places property under the same protection as life and liberty. Except by due process of law, no state can deprive any person of either. The provision has been supposed to secure to every individual the essential conditions for the pursuit of happiness." And so in other words, property, the right to own property, is the foundation of your happiness. Also, what is the legal definition or the essence of what property ownership means? Here's what the Supreme Court said on that subject. They said, "We have repeatedly held that as to property reserved by its owner for private use, the right to exclude others is one of the most essential sticks in the bundle of rights that are commonly characterized as property." And they also said that in this case we hold that the right to exclude, so universally held to be a fundamental element of the property right, falls within this category of interest that the government cannot take without compensation, meaning they're stealing from you if they deprive you of the right to exclude everybody, including them, from using or benefiting from the use of the property. So, the chief characteristics of property are that which belongs exclusively to one. The term property extends to every species of valuable right and interest. Property includes everything which is or could be the subject of ownership, even rights protected by the Constitution are property, and they include the right to the control of the use of the property by others, the right to exclude everyone else's use from benefiting from its use in any way, the right to penalize others for unauthorized use. The use and control over your property in no way depends on another's discretion or courtesy. You can give away your property rights without even realizing it. So, let's go back to what Obama said. He said, quote, "All deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness." And let's translate that into legalese, okay? And here's what it means. All deserve the right to exclusively own private property and to deprive all others from using or benefiting from the use of the property. And by all others, we mean all governments as well. Because why? Because Obama said it. All are equal, meaning you're equal to the government. And if you're not equal, then you're a slave. Why did Barack Obama use the phrase, all are free and all are equal? Here's why. The U.S. Supreme Court said that equality is the foundation of all of your freedom. Here's what they said in 1897 on this subject. No duty rests more imperatively upon the courts than the enforcement of those constitutional provisions intended to secure that equality of rights which is the foundation of free government. So all of your freedom derives from equality of rights of all. The inference is that you are only free if you are equal to the government. Furthermore, the inference is that every attempt to make you inferior or unequal will inevitably turn the government into a religion. It will impute an unconstitutional title of nobility to the United States as a legal person, and it will turn you into a compelled worshiper and a slave. God also spoke about equality in the Bible, and he called it the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is what Jesus said in Matthew 7:12. This is the, quote, God-given promise, unquote, that President Obama was talking about in the preceding video. And once again, that promise is called the Golden Rule. And a corollary to the Golden Rule is that you implicitly consent to any and every action to be done to you that you do to others when you injure someone. And because you consent, you can't complain of an injury in return. In other cultures, they have a different name for this corollary. In India, they call it karma. You invite back everything you do to other people. The Golden Rule also has an Old Testament version. Moses' version of the Golden Rule is found in Deuteronomy 19:21, where he said, "Your eye shall not pity, life shall be for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot." And by saying that, he was emphasizing equality. And also, we find the golden rule in Leviticus 24:19 through 22. If a man causes disfigurement of his neighbor, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has caused disfigurement of a man, so shall it be done to him. And whoever kills an animal shall restore it, but whoever kills a man shall be put to death. Lots of people refer to this rule simply as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. God hates hypocrisy and inequality. What we want to emphasize is the following: that hypocrisy is the same as inequality in Scripture. And here's an example within the modern political sphere of hypocrisy. It's a political cartoon. How can I promote democracy if you misspell it? Correct it now or you'll be fired. And they spelled it with R-I-S-Y at the end here. So he respelled it as hypocrisy, because that's what it is. The Democrats are hypocrites. God hates hypocrisy and inequality, and the evidence of that is found in how Jesus treated the Pharisees. The only thing that Jesus ever got angry at in the Bible was the hypocrisy of the lawyers, the inequality found in the law, and the privileges and statuses that perpetuate the inequality. So obviously God does not like hypocrisy or inequality. He's a God of justice, and justice begins with equality. And here's a picture of the scene where Jesus is in the temple when the money changers took over the temple and were turning the church into a place of business and hypocrisy. They were cashing in on God and his laws. And he was very angry, and he flipped the tables over. And here's what he said, Jesus, in Matthew 23:23 on this subject. Woe to you scribes, that is religious leaders, and Pharisees, that is lawyers, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin to the false god of government with your attorney licenses and your 501c3 and privileged tax exemptions, neither of which any positive law requires, and have neglected the weightier, that is, the most important matters of the law, meaning God's law, which are justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Along these same lines, people and governments are equal according to God. We find in the Bible, in Isaiah 40:15, the following scripture. Behold, the nations, and by the way, nations are made up of governments and politicians, and therefore governments and politicians are as a drop in the bucket and are counted as small dust on the scales. God does not care about governments. They're worthless. And he said the same thing in Isaiah 40:17. All nations, and therefore governments, before him, that is God, are as nothing. They are counted by him as less than nothing and worthless. And yet we find in other scriptures that God talks about how precious we are as his believers. So do you think he wants us to be equal to that which is less than nothing and worthless? And the answer is no. He wants us to be at least superior. Nevertheless, let's give the governments the benefit of the doubt and treat them equally under the law, just like Jesus insisted on. In Isaiah 40:23, God also said, He, that is God, brings the princes and the kings and the presidents to nothing. He makes the judges of the earth useless. How does God make governments useless? The answer to that question is that you cannot govern people who are equal. They need your consent in order for you to become unequal in relation to them. And only by being unequal can you govern them and control them. Those who have consented to be governed and thereby become unequal are called subjects under the civil law, and they are inferior and unequal in relation to their rulers, their civil rulers. No man in his right mind would or should give that consent and surrender his or her equality in relation to any and every government or civil ruler. Therefore, greedy, covetous lawyers have to abuse words of art, trickery, and deception in order to make you unequal under the law, to fool you into volunteering to become a subject, and to hide the fact that they need your consent to govern you, as the Declaration of Independence requires. So, what does God say about all this? He says, indeed, they, the governments, and the men who make them up in relation to God are worthless, and their works are nothing. Their molded images, and by implication their bureaus and agencies, and usurious codes that are not positive law, are wind and vanity and confusion. Do you think God wants us submitting and being subjects to that which is worthless and less than nothing and wind and vanity and confusion? And the answer is absolutely not. And therefore we can never, under his law, consent to become unequal and therefore subjects under any civil law. And under our organic law, starting with the Declaration of Independence, we all start out equal. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator, not by the government or us or a judge, but by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure, not grant or create these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And the implication is that anything that does not derive from consent of the governed is unjust and not enforceable and does not have the force of law in any court of law under the civil law. So how did you become unequal, you might ask? How did you agree to be governed or to become a subject? We'll start with the definition of an unalienable right that was used in the preceding quote from the Declaration of Independence. The legal definition of an unalienable right that God gave us is inalienable, incapable of being aliened, that is, sold and transferred. And there are lots of ways to sell and transfer things. But the bottom line is, and one of them, for instance, is franchises. If you consent to a franchise, you give up rights. If you consent to a government franchise, then you're selling and transferring rights. And because you're not allowed to do that, then by implication, franchises cannot be offered or enforced within a constitutional state without violating the Constitution. And if they are offered, or if they're enforced, then an invasion under Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution has occurred. If you can't lawfully alienate rights in relation to a government, then how can you become unequal or inferior to governments or civil rulers, is our question. The Constitution requires equality and equal treatment. For further details, see the Requirement for Equal Protection and Equal Treatment, Form 05.033, on our website. Absolutely everything that is wrong with the present government is a result of inequality. And as we emphasized, that inequality is a legal impossibility if your rights really are unalienable in relation to a real government. Examples. Government claims the right to counterfeit money using the Federal Reserve, but we go to jail when we imitate their behavior. Another example. Government claims the right to steal money from you to pay for their services without having to take you to court, but it's a crime to do the same thing to them, e.g., taxes. Now, obviously, these are severe cases of what the Bible and Jesus called hypocrisy, but more importantly, of inequality. It is this sort of inequality that is at the heart of why most people criticize or resent civil rulers or governments. And it is this inequality and hypocrisy that must be eliminated to fix the problem. Here are some more examples. Government claims a right to invade and destroy your privacy, and yet IRS agents aren't even required to reveal their real names or their contact information. Another example. Government claims the right to require you to apply for a license when you want to use their property, such as a public roadway, but they refuse to enforce your equal right to force them to waive sovereign immunity and become a target of enforcement when they claim a right over your private property that you didn't consent to. An example is your labor. Certainly they have a right to regulate the use of their property, which is the public roadways, but they don't have a right to make slaves out of everybody who travels on the roadways. They certainly have a right to collect a fee to maintain the roadways, but they don't have a right to make you a slave in order to collect the fee. It's a simple commercial process whereby they should bill you, and if you don't pay, they should take you to court like everybody else. But they don't, do they? And therein lies the problem. More examples. Government claims sovereign immunity, but interferes with your right to do the same thing in civil court. Jesus would get mad at that. That's hypocrisy. Government says you can't trust anything they say or write, but every time we communicate with them, we have to do it under penalty of perjury and could be jailed if it is false. More hypocrisy. We have a funny video on this subject, and we'll give you a brief segment of it with our next slide. What Obama censored from his inauguration speech? Well, think about this. He said all are equal and all are free. Did you listen carefully to that? When he used the word all, do you think he meant governments and people are equal? Because he was speaking about all, and he was in the audience, and he was representing the government when he said it, so he must have meant the government and the people are all equal. Did you notice he didn't tell the whole truth in his inauguration speech? Here is what he should have said if he wanted to tell you the whole truth. All are free because they are equal, and all are free because they refuse to consent to become a subject, citizen, resident, or inhabitant, and all are free because they don't surrender their rights or sovereignty to any government or ruler and can't. They aren't legally allowed to, as per the Declaration of Independence, and all are free because they don't trust anyone, and especially a lawyer, to tell them what the law says and read it for themselves. And all are free because they don't subsidize or contract with lawyers like Obama and can explain and defend their rights in court by themselves. That is why they're free. And that is the only way they can continue to be free. Now, do you know why even the courts say you should never rely on anything a politician or government worker says as fact or legal evidence of anything? It's because all they ever do is lie to you. And now we'll talk about the necessary precursors to being free. You can only be free if you know the law and regularly read and learn it. You can only be free if you know the legal definition of property, and if you know what rights are property, you know that rights are property, and you also know that the two types of rights are public and private. You can only be free if you know that government's first job is to keep the two types of rights separate and never convert them one to the other without express consent of the owner. And by that we mean they never ever convert a private right exclusively owned by you and controlled by you and unregulated by you. They never convert that to a public right or a privilege or public property or anything they can control or regulate without your consent. And if they do, they're stealing. And you can only be free if you know that if government won't protect you from their own abuses, crimes, or thefts, you have no obligation to hire them to protect you from anyone else by becoming a, quote, taxpayer, unquote. You can only be free if you know that rights that are unequal are privileges and public rights rather than private rights. Why? Because they can't take away private rights. They're unalienable. You can only be free if you have exclusive ownership and control over your own body and all property interest created through the use of your own body, meaning the fruit of your labor. The courts recognize and defend your equal right to absolutely own property and to exclude all others from using or benefiting from the use of your property. In other words, if the courts will prevent anybody from taking your property from you without your consent, then you are the absolute owner. Absolute ownership means that ownership or the benefits of ownership are not shared with anyone else, including governments or the IRS, considering the fact that the people and the government are equal. If you can't steal your neighbor's property, then you can't create a group of people, give it a label called government, and authorize it to steal for you. Now, can you? That's the foundation of your freedom, equality. If you're equal to your neighbor and you are equal to the government, then what your neighbor can't do, the government can't do either. You can only be free if you know what kind of court you're in. A constitutional court that defends private rights, or a franchise court that defends only public rights. You can only be free if courts insist that all rights or interests in your property can only be acquired when the party asserting it produces legal evidence of your express consent to surrender the entire property or some portion or interest in it to them. You can only be free if all property is conclusively presumed to be private property whose ownership is not shared with the government unless and until the government satisfies the burden of proving one of the following: that you hurt someone with it, in which case they can take it away without your consent, or you consented to donate it to a public use or purpose. You can only be free when everyone, including especially the government, understands and respects all components of the above. And you can only be free when civil statutes and the public rights that attach to them are not enforced against those who are not consensually domiciled on the territory of the government. So now we're going to talk about when freedom is impossible. Freedom is impossible if they can compel you into involuntary servitude, also called slavery. It's impossible when there is no private property, meaning if there's no private property, then you can't own yourself. and they own you, and you're just a farm animal on their farm, their corporate farm. Freedom is impossible when you're ignorant of the law. The Bible says on this subject, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Freedom is impossible when the government has either absolute or qualified ownership of everything. This is the essence of socialism. Socialism is either government ownership or government control of all property in some form. And we think of control and ownership as synonymous. If they tell you that you own it, and yet they can tell you how to use it or what you can't use it for, as long as it doesn't hurt other people, then essentially they are the owner and you're just a custodian. Freedom is impossible when they can withhold any essential government service until you consent to some specific thing. This is called privileged induced slavery. Freedom is impossible when they can define the terms on forms or compel you to submit forms. They will always define it in a way that benefits them and injures you, and they will always presume that you consented to submit the form unless you indicated duress. And freedom is impossible when you are compelled to consent or presume to consent to anything the government offers. Those who consent cannot complain of an injury, and therefore you can't sue them if you consent. Freedom is impossible when there is even one thing that you absolutely must have from them to exist or to live. They can make you give up anything and everything to get it, including all of your freedom. Surrendering all rights for the sake of expediency is also called the ancient system of pledging. It is the origin of the phrase pyramid scheme, and it started with Pharaoh in the Bible and the Israelites. Once again, it's called a pyramid scheme. And here's why they call it a pyramid scheme. Because it was the first pyramid scheme. Right out of the Bible, Genesis 47:18 through 22. When that year had ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We will not hide from my Lord that our money is gone. My Lord also has our herds of livestock." And what's being described here is a famine in Egypt, and the Israelites living in Egypt under Pharaoh and needing bread to eat, or else they would die. And at this point, they had already given up all their money and all their livestock, and they had to pledge themselves as slaves in order to procure food to even continue to exist. And that's why we say that you should, if the government can withhold any essential service needed to survive, then they can enslave all. Continuing on, there is nothing left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread. In other words, they're buying people as slaves, as cattle. And it says, and we and our land will be servants of Pharaoh, meaning slaves, meaning public officers. Give us seed, that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate. Then Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every man, and he probably got a really good bargain for it, because everybody was desperate and had no money, and they would take anything. It was a fire sale, or a pyramid sale, however you want to describe it. And it says, for every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them, so the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he moved them into the cities, from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priest he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations which Pharaoh gave them, therefore they did not sell their lands. And so in this sense, the cities became basically a cattle yard for his livestock, because he owned the whole city. He owned all the land, and he probably rented it back to them when the famine was over. So moving on, verse 25, so they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord. And notice it's a lowercase Lord, meaning he's a pagan deity, just like the present day government is. And we will be Pharaoh's servants, meaning slaves. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, meaning 20%, except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. So basically, Pharaoh wanted twice as much as God wanted, didn't he? God only asks for 10% in the Bible, and he calls it a tithe. But that's not enough for Pharaoh. He wants 20%. He wants twice as much, and he wants to own everything. He wants to own all the land. He wants to own the people as slaves. He wants to own the livestock. He wants to rent it all back to them. That is the worst sort of oppression, and that is called a pyramid scheme. And it's also called the ancient system of pledging, because the Israelites pledged themselves as collateral for the loan of, in this case, simply food to exist. In today's world, we have a parallel or a metaphor for this same sort of pyramid scheme. And here it is, the Federal Reserve. That's why the pyramid is on the back of the money, because it's a big pyramid scheme. They manipulate the supply of money. They create a crisis, such as the Great Depression. Then everybody has to sell their houses on a fire sale and goes upside down. And then they go out and buy it for a bargain with counterfeited money. And then they rent it back to you. And you have to get a taxpayer identification number to even buy anything. And all this counterfeited money flooding the marketplace forces everybody to become debt slaves of the Federal Reserve and the government, because otherwise they can't afford the inflated prices of things if they simply tried to save, because they're punished for saving, because the interest rates on the savings accounts are 1 or 2%, and the real inflation rate plus the tax rate causes a negative growth on your savings. So you really can't save anything, and you have to become a slave of their pyramid scheme.